McClellan's apparent apathy in this matter, taken in conjunction with the disaster at Ball's Bluff, gradually gave rise in Mr. Lincoln's mind to a loss of confidence in him as a leader which was never fully restored, and which materially influenced the course of events. Lincoln was now accumulating a force which seemed enormous. The expense incurred was certainly very great, and he became impatient to see reprisals. McClellan calmly advised waiting until he had collected and thoroughly organized an army of about 273,000 men, which he said would take the blockading batteries without firing a gun. Lincoln submitted, but his discontent was increased. Meanwhile, winter put in its appearance. The vicinity of each army became a vast quagmire, and all military operations became impossible. The Confederate army was withdrawn to Centreville and the vicinity of Bull Run, where it went into winter quarters. Soon after this, Beauregard was transferred to the Western Army under General A.S. Johnston. His position in Virginia had been that of a supernumerary, and in his new position it was little better until after the Battle of Shiloh, where Johnston was killed as he was about to grasp a victory. Beauregard was not yet immune to attacks of overcaution, the bane of new commanders, and his excellent chance to win a great success was lost. He recalled his attack just at the critical moment when it gave every promise of developing a panic among the enemy. General Joseph E. Johnston at this time had organized his army into 4 divisions, 2 of 4 brigades each, commanded by Van Dorn and G. W. Smith, and 2 of 5 each, under Longstreet and E. Kirby Smith. These 18 brigades averaged about 4 regiments, and the regiments averaged about 500 men each. Besides these, there were other troops under Jackson in the valley and under Holmes near Acquia. The total effective strength on February 28, 1862, was 47,617, with about 175 guns. Early in March, the Federal Army was organized into 5 Army Corps under McDowell, Sumner, Heintzelman, Keyes, and Banks. Each corps was generally composed of 3 divisions, each division of 3 brigades, and each brigade of 4 regiments. The regiments were generally fuller than ours, and would average about 700 men. The total effective strength of all arms on February 28, 1862, was 185,420, with 465 field guns, of which 100 were massed in a reserve under the Chief of Artillery. During the winter, the Federal engineers had completely surrounded Washington with a cordon of fortifications, consisting of detached forts impregnable to assault, with heavy guns and permanent garrisons connected by infantry parapets and batteries for field guns. Within these lines, a small movable force could defy any adversary not able to sit down and resort to siege operations. This was amply shown when Lee, in August 1862, drove Pope into Washington, and also in July 1864, when Early made his demonstration, but withdrew without venturing to attack. The federal government, however, had received such a scare in the Bull Run campaign that it had small confidence in fortifications without a big army to hold them. So when McClellan proposed to make his next advance upon Richmond from Fortress Monroe as a base, Mr. Lincoln gave but reluctant consent, as it involved the removal of a large body of troops from their position between the enemy and the capital. At length he agreed that about 73,000 would be enough to keep for the defence of Washington. This would allow McClellan to have about 150,000 at Fortress Monroe. Early in April, however, under some strong political pressure, Mr. Lincoln detached Blenker's division, about 10,000 men, from McClellan's force, and sent them to Fremont in West Virginia. Before taking up the history of this campaign, it will be interesting to take a general view of all routes to Richmond, which were tried during the war. There were 7 campaigns under as many different commanders. First, McDowell set out to follow the Orange and Alexandria Railway, but was defeated at Manassas in his first battle. Second, McClellan set out from Fortress Monroe via the York River. As we shall see, he had some success. His advance was within 6 miles of Richmond when he was beaten at Gaines' Mill. He found a refuge on the James River, but his army was soon recalled to Washington. Third, Pope, in August 1862, followed in McDowell's footsteps along the railroad from Alexandria and was defeated upon nearly the same ground which had witnessed McDowell's defeat. 4th, Burnside took the railroad via Fredericksburg, and in December 1863 met a bloody repulse at that point and gave up his campaign. 5th, Hooker also took the Fredericksburg route but was attacked at Chancellorsville so severely that he also gave up his campaign early in May 1863. 6th, Meade, after repulsing Lee at Gettysburg in July 1863, in November essayed an advance from Alexandria upon Lee's right flank at Mine Run, about halfway between the two railroad lines. He found Lee so strongly entrenched that he withdrew without attacking. 7th, on May 4, 1864, Grant, with the largest force yet assembled, set out from Alexandria on a line between Meade's Mine Run and Hooker's Spotsylvania routes. Lee attacked his columns in the Wilderness. The battle thus joined raged for over 11 months and only ended at Appomattox on April 9, 1865. Our only concern here is to note the advantages and the disadvantages of the different lines. The overland route again proved a failure. At Spotsylvania, North Anna, Totopotomoy, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg, Grant found Lee across his path and was unable to drive him off. His only recourse on each occasion was to move to his left and try the next road to the eastward. And now every intermediate road had been tried, and after losing 65,000 men, he was only on the James River with Fortress Monroe as his base, where his fleet might have landed him at the beginning, and without losing a man. Here at last, literally driven into the location in front of Petersburg, Grant found himself in a position of rare strategic advantage, certain to give him possession of Richmond when properly utilized. Indeed, it seems strange that it had not been realized in 1862 that the position astraddle both rivers at the junction of the James and Appomattox was the key to Richmond, for it would force Lee to hold an exterior line of such enormous length, from the Chickahominy River to the south of Petersburg, nearly 30 miles, that it could not be long maintained. As McClellan selected the York River line before the James River was opened, by the loss of Norfolk and of the ironclad Merrimac, he is entitled to the credit of having selected the best route available at the time. After his retreat from Richmond, he very nearly had stumbled into the key position itself. His army was recalled to Washington by the executive against his strong protests and appeals. Johnston fully realized that his inferiority of force left him no recourse but to stand upon the defensive and watch to take advantage of any blunders his enemy might make. And it was ordered from Richmond, very prudently, that the army should be withdrawn from Manassas before the roads became good. Johnston's movement was accordingly begun on March 8th, which was some weeks before it would have been possible for McClellan to move his army. He followed Johnston's withdrawal slowly for a short distance, but there was no collision. A considerable loss of provisions resulted to the Confederates from the condition of the roads and the fact that their commissary department had established a meat-packing depot on the Manassas Gap Railroad at Thoroughfare Gap, and accumulated there an amount of stores much greater than the railroad could remove upon short notice. The army paused for a while behind the Rappahannock, but then took a better position behind the Rapidan, where it awaited developments. Meanwhile, on March 23rd, something took place in the valley. Stonewall Jackson had been in command there of 2 small brigades through the winter, but had fallen back about 40 miles south of Winchester when Johnston's army abandoned Manassas. Banks's Federal Corps had been opposed to him, and it was now ordered to Manassas. Jackson learned of the movement in progress, and, believing that he might surprise its rear, and at least disconcert plans, he made a march of 36 miles in a day and a half, and fell upon his enemy at Kernstown. His attack was so vigorous that for a while it bore promise of success, but the Federal force at hand was largely greater than had been anticipated. It consisted of Shields's division of 3 brigades, about 10,000 men. Jackson had upon the field only about 3,500. Consequently, when the battle became fully developed, Jackson was driven off with a loss of 455 killed and wounded and 263 captured. Shields lost 568 killed and wounded and 22 captured. It was a small affair and apparently a Federal victory, but it was broadcast upon strategic waters. There soon followed a serious development. Jackson's name and aggressiveness and the fierceness of his attack all tended to increase Mr. Lincoln's reluctance to see Washington stripped of any force available for its defense. He had already taken Blenker's division of 10,000 men from McClellan, and now, on April 4th, he took also McDowell's corps of 37,000, ordering it to report to the Secretary of War. As the result of that order was to keep McDowell out of the 7 days' battles in June, Jackson's battle at Kernstown, though generally reckoned a defeat, was really the first step to Lee's victory in June. Chapter 4. Yorktown and Williamsburg. In the latter part of March, the Confederate signal lines began to report the movement of a great army down the Potomac, and it was soon discovered that it was being concentrated at Fortress Monroe. On April 5th, some V divisions of Federal infantry with cavalry and artillery from that point approached the Confederate lines across the peninsula at Yorktown. These were held by General Magruder, whose force at the time was only about 13,000 men. They occupied a line about 12 miles in length, partly behind the Warwick River and partly protected by slight earthworks. Another opportunity as good as that offered McDowell at Bull Run was here offered to McClellan, who could have rushed the position anywhere. He contented himself, however, with some cannonading and sharpshooting. Of course, he was still under the Pinkerton delusion as to the enemy's strength. Magruder, who was expecting reinforcements, made the bravest possible display, exhibiting the same troops repeatedly at different points. It was just at this juncture, when a great success was in McClellan's grasp, had he had the audacity to risk something, that the news reached him that Lincoln had taken from him McDowell's 37,000 men. This, doubtless, had its effect in discouraging him and leading him to resort to siege operations against Yorktown instead of attempting to pass the position by main force. Meanwhile, Johnston had been summoned to Richmond and had advised Davis that a defence of Yorktown involved great risk and at best could gain no important result. He advocated its abandonment and the concentration at Richmond of all forces from Virginia to Georgia. With these, McClellan's force should be attacked when it came near Richmond. A conference was called, which included Lee, Longstreet, G.W. Smith, and the Sec of War, Randolph. It was advocated by Lee, and finally determined, that Johnston should risk making all the delay possible at Yorktown. This was a safe conclusion to reach, only in view of the cautiousness of McClellan. Johnston had already begun sending some reinforcements to Magruder, and had brought a large part of his army near Richmond. About upward of 15 he went to Yorktown, taking Smith's and Longstreet's divisions, which gave him a total force of 55,633. In the whole course of the war there was little service as trying as that in the Yorktown lines. There was much rain and the country was low and flat, so that the trenches were badly drained and would frequently be flooded with water. The general flatness left no cover in rear of the lines. The enemy's rifle pits were within range and view at many points, and the fire of sharpshooters with telescopic rifles was incessant, and that of artillery was often severe. At many important points, the crowded ranks in the trenches had to either sit or crouch behind the parapet, in water up to their knees. From daylight until darkness permitted one to rise upright or to step outside of the trench. The only rest at night was to sleep in the universal mud and water. Although the men in the worst locations were relieved as often as possible, an unusual amount of sickness resulted. Jenner D.H. Hill wrote in his official report, "Our revolutionary sires did not suffer more at Valley Forge than did our army at Yorktown, and in the retreat from it. Notwithstanding the rain, mud, cold, hunger, watching, and fatigue, I never heard a murmur or witnessed an act of insubordination. The want of discipline manifested itself only in straggling, which was and still is the curse of our army. This monstrous evil can only be corrected by a more rigid government and a sterner system of punishment than have yet been introduced into our service. During our stay here, a reorganization of the army took place. The majority of our troops had enlisted for a year in the spring of 1861. It was now necessary to re-enlist them for the war. Congress had enacted that re-enlistment furloughs should be given to a few men at a time, and that a re-election of officers should take place in each regiment. This feature was very detrimental to the standard of good discipline. During the whole of the siege there was but one affair of any consequence, and it is of interest principally as indicating the great improvement wrought in the Federal troops by the discipline which had been given them during the fall and winter. On April 16, a Federal reconnaissance was made by W. F. Smith's division of a position on our lines called Dam No. 1. Here our entrenchment, at the upper part of Warwick Creek, was protected by inundations. Just below Dam No. 1, the inundation from No. 2 was only about waist deep and perhaps 100 yards wide, thickly grown up with trees and undergrowth. These facts were discovered by a bold reconnaissance under cover of a heavy fire. 4 companies of the 3D West were ordered to cross the inundation and develop what we had on the other side. They made their advance very handsomely, fording the overflow, and actually got possession of our line of infantry parapet some 20 yards on the farther side. This was occupied at the time by only a picket line of the 15th N.C. Colours-McKinney, the rest of the regiment being at work upon a second line 200 yards in the rear. McKinney promptly formed his regiment and moved forward to drive the enemy out, but was killed, and his men repulsed in confusion, the enemy fighting from the far side of our parapet. Presently, however, the brigade commander, Howell Cobb, arrived, and as the enemy were not reinforced, after holding their ground for perhaps a half hour, they retreated, losing 83 men out of 192 who crossed the stream. The entire casualties of the Federals were 165. The casualties of the 15th N.C. were 12 killed and 31 wounded. It was plain from this affair that the fighting we would soon have to face was to be something better than that of 1861. Meanwhile, McClellan was preparing for Yorktown a terrific bombardment by which he hoped to wreck our water batteries so that his fleet could pass us. Siege batteries mounting 71 guns, including 2 200 PDRs rifles and 5 100 PDRs, and several 13-inch mortars were being rapidly mounted. On May 1st, his 100 PDRs rifles opened fire, and by May 6th he expected all the other batteries to be able to join in. But Johnston had never intended to risk siege operations at this point, and at sundown on May 3rd put his army in motion toward Richmond. His heavy guns were fired actively all the day before and until midnight, when the artillerists spiked them and withdrew. I recall that night's march as particularly disagreeable. The whole soil of that section seemed to have no bottom and no supporting power. The roads were but long strings of guns, wagons, and ambulances, mixed in with infantry, artillery, and cavalry, splashing and bogging through the darkness in a river of mud, with frequent long halts when some stalled vehicle blocked the road. Then men from the nearest ranks would swarm in to help the jaded horses pull the vehicle out. Meanwhile, everything in the rear must halt and wait, and so it went on all night, a march of 1 or 2 minutes, and halt for no one could guess how long. The average time made by the column was under a mile an hour. Our movement was not discovered by the enemy until after daylight on the 4th. His cavalry was at once started in pursuit, and these were followed during the day by 5 divisions of infantry under Smith, Hooker, Kearney, Couch, and Casey, the whole under command of Sumner. Besides these, Franklin's division was loaded upon transports during the day, and early on the 6th sailed up the York to intercept us near West Point. 2 other divisions, Sedgwick's and Richardson's, were also to have been sent by water, and McClellan remained in Yorktown to see them loaded and dispatched. But the fighting next day at Williamsburg proved so severe that he rode to the front and had both divisions to follow him. Near Williamsburg, Magruder had, some months before, selected a line of battle across the peninsula 4 or 5 miles long, on which he had, at a few places, some slight entrenchments with slashings of timber in front, and, about the centre, an enclosed fort of some size, called Fort Magruder. As the rear of our column came into Williamsburg during the afternoon of the 4th, the enemy's cavalry suddenly appeared so near to this fort that Semmis's tired infantry brigade had to be taken back at the double quick to occupy it, and a sharp skirmish was fought before sundown. McLaws reinforced Semmis with Kershaw and 2 batteries, and we captured one of the enemy's guns, stuck in the mud, 10 horses being unable to get it off. After dark, Kershaw and Semmis were relieved by Anderson's and Pryor's brigades of Longstreet's division. That night we stayed at Williamsburg, and it poured rain all night. About 2 a.m. the leading divisions were pushed forward. Johnston was anxious to get his troops ahead to meet the forces he expected McClellan to send by water to West Point. To hold the enemy in check at Williamsburg, Longstreet retained his whole division of 6 brigades as a rear guard. Soon after daylight on the 5th, the enemy developed their presence before Pryor and Anderson. Hooker's and Smith's Federal divisions had reached the field about dark on the 4th. The fighting began with fire upon our lines from artillery and skirmishers, and gradually increased in volume. The whole of Longstreet's division was brought up, and advanced upon the enemy in the edge of the wood, where it captured one of his batteries. Toward noon, when it became evident from the slow progress of the marching columns that the enemy would have to be held off until night, Johnston returned to the field, and the division of D.H. Hill, which had only advanced a short distance from Williamsburg, was brought back as a reserve. One of its brigades, Early's, was divided, 2 regiments sent into the fight on our right, and the other 4 sent out in observation beyond our left flank. D.H. Hill and Early both went with this left column, and got into trouble from a little superfluous aggressiveness. On the extreme right of the Federals, General Hancock had discovered some vacant entrenchments, part of Magruder's old line, before mentioned. With 5 regiments, parts of 2 brigades, and 10 guns, he occupied a commanding ridge and opened artillery toward the Confederate lines. Early, on lower ground and in the woods, could not see Hancock's position, but suggested an attack to Hill. Hill approved, but referred the question to Johnston. Johnston, who had left the battle entirely to Longstreet's direction, referred it to the latter. Longstreet very properly refused to give permission, as we fought only to cover our retreat up the peninsula, and it was assured. But this message taken to Hill did not satisfy him. He was a brother-in-law of Stonewall Jackson, and was a soldier of the same type. He visited Longstreet in person, and Longstreet now weakly yielded to his appeal. Raines's brigade had meanwhile been brought up behind Early's, and it would have been possible to organize an attack which might have routed Hancock. But Hill, to lose no time, began the formation of the 4 regiments for the charge. The distance to be traversed was over half a mile, much of it wood and swamp. Hill placed the 4 regiments in a line of battle extending through a wood, with Early leading the 2 left regiments, while he led the 2 right. But Early mistook one of Hill's commands to his own wing for the order to charge, and he led off at once with his left regiment, the 24th VAR, which had open ground before it. Hill's extreme right regiment, the 5th N.C., also had open ground in front, and, soon becoming aware that a charge had been begun, it also advanced without orders. Hill, tangled in wood and swamp with the 2 centre regiments, could do nothing. After passing the wood between them, the 2 outside regiments could see each other and the Federal guns, now scarcely 500 yards distant in front. These guns immediately opened a severe fire of shell and canister. The 5th N.C. obliqued to its left to close the wide gap between them, and both advanced to the charge, reserving their fire generally until within 150 yards of the enemy. A large portion of Hancock's infantry lay concealed behind the crest of the ridge until the 2 regiments, now with ranks disorganized by their advance, were within 30 yards when the Federals raised and fired, advancing over the crest and continuing the fire for 15 or 20 rounds. Hancock says in his official report, "The plunging fire from the redoubt, the direct fire from the right, and the oblique fire from the left were so destructive that after it had been ordered to cease and the smoke arose, it seemed that no man had left the ground unhurt who had advanced within 500 yards of our line. The enemy's assault was of the most determined character. No troops could have made a more resolute charge. The 5th North Carolina was annihilated. Nearly all of its superior officers were left dead or wounded on the field. The 24th Virginia suffered greatly in superior officers and men. General Early, Coleman Terry, and Lieutenant Cole Hairston of the 24th VAO all fell severely wounded, and the regiment lost, killed 30, wounded 93, missing 66, total 190. In the 5th NC, Lieutenant Cole Badham was killed, and the regiment lost about 50% of its members, but no official report was made. Hancock reported his losses in the affair as killed 10, wounded 88, missing 31, total 129. This affair about terminated the fighting. It had rained nearly all day, and on our right Longstreet simply kept back the enemy's advance by fire and by threatening their flanks. The total Federal casualties as reported were killed 456, wounded 1410, missing 373, total 2239. The Confederate casualties, reported by Longstreet only, were officers 102, men 1458, total 1560. We captured 12 guns, of which 5 were brought off, 5 were chopped down with axes, and 2 had to be left, as neither horses or axes were available. We also brought off about 400 prisoners. As far as possible, the wounded were brought into Williamsburg, and soon after dark our march was resumed over roads now even worse than any we had had before. I rode with Johnston's staff, and late in the forenoon of May 6th we were at Barhamsville, and the greater part of the army was halted and resting in the vicinity. It had been a special feature of McClellan's strategy that on our retreat from Yorktown we should be intercepted at Eltham's Landing by a large force. But our battle at Williamsburg had proved a double victory, for it had prevented Franklin's division from being reinforced so as to be either formidable or aggressive. It arrived at the mouth of the Pamunkey at 5 p.m. on the 6th. During the night it disembarked and next morning reconnoitred its vicinity and took a defensive position, sending Newton's and Slocum's brigades through a large wood to examine the country beyond. On the far edge of that wood, about 9 a.m., their skirmishers ran into those of Hood's and Hampton's brigades of Whiting's division, which were there to see that our trains passed without interruption. The Federals fell back and were followed until they were under the protection of Franklin's entrenched camp, and all our trains passed unmolested. The Federals reported killed 48, wounded 110, missing 28, total 186. The Confederate loss was but 8 killed and 40 wounded, and they captured 46 prisoners. There was no further effort to interfere with our retreat. This was continued at leisure until the 9th, when we halted on the north bank of the Chickahominy. Chapter 5. 7 Pines or Fair Oaks. Meanwhile, Norfolk had now been evacuated by our forces, which were withdrawn at first to Petersburg and then to Richmond. Our ironclad, the Virginia, the old Merrimac, drawing too much water to ascend the James, had been blown up. This river was now open to the Federal fleet, except for some hurriedly built batteries at Drury's Bluff, about 6 miles below Richmond, covering obstructions made of a row of piles and some sunken schooners. On May 15th, the fleet, which included 3 ironclads, the Monitor, Galena and Naugatuck, attacked the batteries, but was repulsed with 25 killed and wounded, and considerable injury to some of the vessels. Until that time, Johnston had contemplated fighting on the north of the Chickahominy, but he now decided to concentrate his army nearer Richmond, and on May 17th it was all encamped within 3 or 4 miles to the east of the city. The situation had grown very threatening, for McDowell's army, still at Fredericksburg with 31,000 men, had again been assigned to McClellan. He only awaited the arrival of Shields, marching to join him with 11,000 more before advancing. If it was now in Johnston's power to do anything to save Richmond, it must be done before McDowell arrived. It was not likely that McClellan would himself seek battle when such a large reinforcement was near. Johnston's only chance, therefore, lay in taking the offensive. He had no such works to rely upon as the Federals had around Washington. There were indeed a few small enclosed forts, erected during the first year of the war, each armed with a few of the smoothbore guns of that day, but they were located too near the city limits to have any value. The lines in which we afterward fought were but light infantry trenches with occasional barbette batteries, usually thrown up by the troops under emergency. The enemy soon followed us up and established a line of battle, upon which at different points earthworks began to appear. His right flank, on the north bank of the Chickahominy, rested upon Beaver Dam Creek, a strong position which Johnston's engineers had selected for our own left flank before we left Yorktown, when Johnston contemplated fighting on that bank. Hence, the Federal line extended southeast along the Chickahominy some 3 miles to New Bridge. Then, crossing this stream, it bent south and ran to White Oak Swamp, where the left rested, giving about 4 miles on the south side in a line convex toward Richmond, and scarcely 6 miles away at its nearest point. In observation of McDowell at Fredericksburg was General J.R. Anderson at Hanover Junction with about 9,000 men, and near Hanover C.H. was Branch's brigade, about 4,500. Johnston directed that these forces should be drawn behind the Chickahominy, on our left, and united into a new division under A.P. Hill. Before this could be accomplished, however, Branch was attacked by Morell's division and Warren's brigade of Porter's Corps, and was forced back with a loss of about 300 killed and wounded, and 700 prisoners, the enemy reporting 62 killed, 223 wounded, and 70 missing, total 355. At Fredericksburg, McDowell's column was at last joined by Shields, who had been detached from Banks in the valley, and on May 26th McDowell was put in motion. In the forenoon of the 27th notice of his advance reached Johnston, who at once recognized that he must now attack before McDowell could unite with McClellan. The latter had moved so cautiously as to offer no favorable opportunity until his last move, which had put his army astride of the Chickahominy. That presented as fair a chance as Johnston could now expect, so he immediately determined to attack on the 29th. As McDowell was approaching behind the enemy's right, his strongest effort would be made to crush that flank. On the 28th, Johnston got his troops into position to attack at dawn on the 29th. 3 of his 7 divisions, Whiting's, A.P. Hill's, and D.R. Jones's, were to attack Porter's Corps at Beaver Dam. The other 4 divisions on the south side of the Chickahominy, McLaws's, Longstreet's, D.H. Hill's, and Huger's, would be held in observation, ready to cross when Porter's Corps was driven back. Everything was in readiness by sundown on the 28th, when further news was received. McDowell had suddenly stopped his advance, and his troops seemed to be falling back toward Manassas. What had happened was that Jackson had again broken loose in the valley and defeated Banks at Strasburg on May 23rd, and at Winchester on May 25th, and was moving on the Potomac, as will be told more fully in a later chapter. This had created a panic at Washington, for rumor had magnified Jackson's forces greatly, and McDowell, just in the nick of time for us, had been turned back for the defence of the capital. Johnston was glad of a respite, and an opportunity to consider as an alternative an attack upon McClellan's left. The strength of the position at Beaver Dam Creek made any direct attack very dangerous, and to turn it would consume time. To attack the enemy's left was certainly a safer proposition. On the south side his force was smaller and was much more easily gotten at, and while it was already partially fortified by abattis and trenches, quickly constructed in that and wooded country, yet they had had time to do but little. Longstreet urged going on with the attack for which the troops were already in position, but Johnston decided to withdraw the troops north of the Chickahominy during the night of the 28th, and to have reconnaissances made to discover the location and strength of the enemy's position on the south side. Accordingly, on the 29th and again on the 30th, 1 or 2 regiments were advanced and drove in the enemy's pickets on our extreme right flank, developing his presence and that he was fortifying. This being reported to Johnston by D.H. Hill soon after noon on the 30th, Hill was informed in reply that he would lead an attack upon the enemy next morning. There was nothing to gain by further delay, for by the arrival at Richmond of Huger's division from Norfolk on the 29th, Johnston now had all the force possible to get. His problem was to defeat 4 divisions of the enemy, 12 brigades fortified, and crush them before assistance could cross the Chickahominy to their relief. If he could do this quickly, his chance was good to involve in the defeat also some of the reinforcements the enemy would be sending across the bridges. He had 7 divisions, 27 brigades, numbering about 60,000 infantry and artillery. The 4 divisions to be attacked numbered about 37,000. Considering the morale of our men, which will appear more fully after a description of the battle, the proposition was an easy one, if only we could succeed in bringing our fighting strength to bear in the right places and at the right times. But just there lay our greatest difficulty and weakness. Our army was not yet organised into corps, our divisions were often too large, and our staff service, by which information and orders were disseminated, was insufficient in amount and deficient in technical training and experience. Johnston was endeavouring to remedy some of these evils by assigning his ranking officers, G.W. Smith, Longstreet and Magruder, to command 2 or more divisions each, which he called wings and centre. But such temporary arrangements are always more apt to mar than to promote unity of action. And our general himself was impatient and unmindful of small detail. Let us now have the story of what happened. To use the slang expression, it was up to Johnston to play, and in a conference with Longstreet during the afternoon of May 30th, the battle for the next day was planned in accordance with the intimation given D.H. Hill about noon. The conference was prolonged by the coming up of a violent rainstorm, scarcely second to any in violence, according to my recollection that I saw during the war. Over 3 inches of rain must have fallen in the first 2 hours, and it kept up, more or less, until late at night. It was hoped that this rain would make our task easier by rendering the Chickahominy impassable for reinforcements to the enemy. Indeed, it did have this effect, but not until the night of the day after the rain. The immediate effect was only to make all of our marchings and manoeuvres slower and more difficult, and the flat, swampy country of much of the battlefield was entirely inundated. During this afternoon, prolonged by the rainstorm, Johnston gave verbal instructions to Longstreet as to the battle of the next day, and it is hard to imagine how any serious misunderstanding of such a simple movement could have taken place in a conversation prolonged for hours. One would need to have heard the whole of it to tell how it arose. But Johnston afterward recognized the fact that it had occurred, and wrote to G.W. Smith that the misunderstanding may be my fault, as I told you at the time. Smith, however, denies recollection of any such telling. The following sketch will illustrate the misunderstanding. Johnston intended to have the battle begun at an early hour by D.H. Hill's division of 4 brigades, 3 of which were already in position in the front line, on our extreme right on the Williamsburg Road. Rhodes was on picket on the Charles City Road, not far off, and unfortunately Johnston's plan included his being relieved and joining his division before the attack was begun. Any preliminary movement, however simple it may appear, will usually turn up fated to cause unexpected delay. Rhodes is ordered to be relieved by a brigade of Huger's division of 3 brigades, now in camp on the north bank of Gillis Creek near Richmond. This is ordered at an early hour to go down the Charles City Road and relieve Rhodes, after which it will guard and protect Hill's right flank and render it aid if opportunity offers. Longstreet's division of 5 brigades is in camp on the 9-mile road nearest the Chickahominy on our left. Johnston's plan is that it shall march straight down that road, perhaps 3 miles, pass our line of battle, here held by Magruder's division, form line of battle, and listen for the sounds of battle begun by D.H. Hill's attack upon Casey's division, which will be within a mile or 2 of his front and right. He will be in a position to take Casey on the right flank, and with Hill's 4 brigades, having abundant force, can hope to make short work of it. Meanwhile, Whiting's division of 5 brigades, considered a part of Smith's wing, had been a part of the attack proposed 2 days before, and were still encamped farther up the 9-mile road. After Longstreet left Johnston's headquarters, the rain having slacked, the latter sent word to Smith to order Whiting to march down the 9-mile road early in the morning and take position at our line of battle behind Longstreet to further reinforce him in the battle. Smith came in person some 5 miles, arrived at 4:30 a.m., and now first learned of the proposed attack and had it all explained. Johnston proposed to make his own headquarters on the 9-mile road where he could observe any efforts of the enemy to cross the Chickahominy. It would have been much wiser to have first visited the right and seen his battle started. The whole Confederate plan at Bull Run had gone astray for the lack of this precaution, and now it turned out that Longstreet had understood him either to order or to consent that his division was to be marched across from the 9-mile road to the Williamsburg road and to go into action behind D.H. Hill's division. It will soon appear how utterly this wrecked and ruined Johnston's excellent and simple plan. How the misunderstanding occurred has never been explained, for neither Johnston nor Longstreet in their official reports or other writings ever gave any explanation or even admitted openly that a mistake was made. But Johnston induced G.W. Smith to change his official report to avoid its being made public therein. The official reports also disclose that on that day Longstreet was anxious to have Huger's division recognized as under his command, although Huger was the senior officer. Possibly Longstreet made some request of Johnston for authority over Huger, and Johnston in complying may have thoughtlessly used some expression which Longstreet interpreted as permission to go to the right. But the whole history of this battle remains a monument of caution against verbal understandings. Longstreet's division was early upon the road, and it soon developed that its route to the Williamsburg road cut off and blocked the prescribed marches of both Whiting's and Huger's divisions as they respectively came up. After some delay, Whiting sent a note to Johnston's headquarters, complaining that his march was obstructed by Longstreet. Johnston, supposing only that Longstreet was preceding Whiting down the 9-mile road, as ordered to do, answered to that effect, and G.W. Smith, who was still with Johnston, sent an aide, Captain Beckham, down the 9-mile to overtake Longstreet and learn the cause of any delay. Beckham followed this road to Magruder's line, and not finding Longstreet, guessed that he had gone across to the Williamsburg road. So he sent back a note saying that he would continue his search in that direction. When this note was shown Johnston about 9 a.m., he was still so convinced that Longstreet was upon the 9-mile road that he dispatched his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Washington, down the same road to find him. Washington pushed his investigation so far as to follow the 9-mile into the enemy's pickets where he was captured about 10 a.m. His capture and his disturbed manner when some firing was soon after heard convinced General Keyes that an attack was on foot, and Keyes was accordingly alert and prepared. Meanwhile, Longstreet's column, having delayed Whiting on the 9-mile road for 2 or 3 hours, for the column took its wagons along, found itself next blocking the column of Huger at Gillis Creek. The creek was bank full from the rain. Longstreet says, "The delay of an hour to construct a bridge was preferred to the encounter of more serious obstacles along the narrow lateral road flooded by the storm. As we were earlier at the creek, it gave us precedence of Huger's division, which had to cross after us. As Longstreet knew that one of Huger's brigades must relieve Rhodes's brigade on the Charles City Road, and let it rejoin Hill's division before the battle could commence, it would have saved much to waive this precedence at least for one brigade." Colston, commanding one of these brigades, wrote as follows of this occasion: "A little brook near Richmond was greatly swollen, and a long time was wasted crossing it, on an improvised bridge made of planks, a wagon midstream serving as a trestle. Over this the division passed in single file, you may imagine with what delay. If the division commander had given orders for the men to sling their cartridge boxes, haversacks, etc., on their muskets and wade, without breaking formation, they could have crossed by fours with water up to their waists, and hours would have been saved. When we got across, we received orders to halt on the roadside until Huger's division passed us. There we waited 5 or 6 hours. He had just passed Huger, and now he waits for Huger to pass him. when one contemplates the fact that there was a commanding officer hoping to win a great victory, then at his headquarters within 2 miles of this spot where 9 brigades were thus wasting the precious hours passing and repassing each other, the whole performance seems incredible. And when it is further said that 6 of these brigades were lost, with their commander, and that the staff of the general was seeking them at that moment, high and low, miles away along the picket line, it is almost ludicrous. And any friends of Huger may be excused for finding even a tragic side to the situation. For when the whole affair was over and had ended in defeat, Johnston and Longstreet laid the entire blame upon Huger. I give as illustrations 2 quotations from Johnston, and there were equally disparaging statements by Longstreet. General Longstreet, unwilling to make a partial attack instead of the combined movement which had been planned, waited from hour to hour for Huger's division. Had Huger's division been in position and ready for action when those of Smith, Longstreet and Hill moved, I am satisfied that Keyes's corps would have been destroyed instead of being merely defeated. Had it gone into action even at 4 o'clock, the victory would have been much more complete. After the battles were over and Johnston was recovering from his wound, Huger made vain efforts to have the injurious statements corrected and applied for a court of inquiry. This was promised by the War Department, but it was to be held as soon as the state of the service will permit. The state of the service never permitted, and the court was never held. About 1 p.m., however, Rhodes' brigade was relieved on the Charles City Road and hurried to join the other 3 brigades under Hill, who had fretted greatly under the delay. He started his 2 brigades on the left of the road as soon as he saw Rhodes approaching. The formation was Garland's brigade on the left of the road, followed by G.B. Anderson, Rhodes's brigade on the right, followed by Rains. Each brigade marched in column until the enemy was met, when it formed line. The rear brigades formed about 300 yards behind the leading ones. In Johnston's narrative, he states that Longstreet, as ranking officer of the 3 divisions to be united near Hill's camp, was instructed verbally to form his own and Hill's division in 2 lines, crossing the Williamsburg Road at right angles, and to advance to the attack in that order. But the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming that on the morning of the battle, Johnston was expecting Longstreet to be in position on the 9-mile road, and to support Hill's attack upon the Williamsburg Road by his attack down the 9-mile. That was the only quick way of bringing his large force into proper action, and it is hard to see how the 2 divisions could have failed to crush the enemy in their front. It is no wonder that Johnston said when he found out where Longstreet was, that he wished the troops were all back in their camps, for the victory was surely his if only he could play his game correctly. It was being started badly. It was on a front of only 2 brigades, supported by 2 in a second line, while 9 other brigades encumbered the one good road leading to the battle. From a glance at the field, one might now confidently predict the outcome. It is D.H. Hill's division, about 8,500 strong, excellent troops, and there is not living a more honest fighter than D.H. Hill. They will first meet Casey's division, of about equal strength, partly fortified with trenches and abatis. Behind Casey are 3 other divisions holding 2 other lines partly entrenched. Hill may carry the first line and even have some success against the second. But by that time he will be worn out, and the daylight will be gone before enough of the 9 brigades, those behind him, can be gotten to him in force to cut any figure. The fighting on this road cannot amount to more than a bloody draw, prolonged until night. That is what anyone, knowing the conditions, might have predicted, and that is just what happened. To follow all the details is useless, but the list of casualties and some brief descriptions of incidents will give a good idea of the fighting. The Confederate reports of casualties, particularly in battles fought during active campaigns, are far from being full and are not at all uniform in their shape and detail. Complete figures, therefore, for the whole division cannot be given. Of Rains's brigade, the official report only states that its losses were 1/7 of the force. The reports show that this brigade was employed in a flank movement around the enemy's left, which it executed successfully, but did not repeat it. Hill expressed disappointment and says that Rains might have saved Rhodes' brigade from suffering 500 casualties. Rains fought on the left. Had Longstreet's division that morning not gone astray, all of its brigades would have been on the enemy's flank and have had similar chances. The other 3 brigades reported their strength and losses as follows. This record shows great fighting power and will compare favourably for a half-day's fighting of an equal body of men with any records of the war. At Waterloo, the losses were Allies 20%, French 34%, British regulars 29%. At Balaclava, the Light Brigade, 600, lost 49%. On the Federal side, the battle was opened by Casey's division, moderately well fortified with trenches, batteries and abatis, and soon supported by Peck's brigade of Couch's division. These 4 brigades were finally routed from their first line by the Rains's flank movement. They then fell back upon the second entrenched line, where they united with Couch's 2 remaining brigades. Rains's brigade now dropped out of the fighting. The 3 other brigades pushed their attack upon the enemy's second line, which was now being reinforced by Kearny's division, but Hill received also a reinforcement of R. H. Anderson's brigade, which he divided. 2 regiments under Jenkins he sent to the left and the remainder under Anderson to his right. A little later also he received 2 regiments, the 11th Ayler and the 19th Miss of Wilcox's brigade. With this help, the second line was carried. 4 Federal regiments and a battery retreated north toward the Chickahominy unpursued. The remainder fell back slowly, and night put an end to the fighting. Kemper's brigade also arrived, brought by Longstreet to Hill's aid. It came upon the field, but too late to take effective part. On the Federal side, Hooker's division also came up as the fighting ceased. Hill's division was now worn out, and Longstreet relieved it from the 7 idle brigades still left on the Charles City and Williamsburg roads. Hill's forces during the battle had averaged about 4 brigades, for R. H. Anderson had come up, after Rains dropped out with a loss of only 14%. Anderson's losses are not given, but they were severe and probably equalled the average of Hill's. Jenkins's official report says, "We never fought twice in the same place, nor 5 minutes in one place, and steadily on the advance, were under fire from 3 p.m. to 7:40 p.m. The service we did will be evidenced by our list of killed and wounded. In my 2 colour companies out of 80 men who entered, 40 were killed or wounded, and out of 11 in the colour guard 10 were shot down, and my colours, pierced by 9 balls, passed through 4 hands without touching the ground." The following shows a comparison of the total casualties of Hill's part of the battle, as nearly as they can be ascertained, including the 3 brigades already given. The Confederates captured 10 guns, 5,000 muskets, and about 400 prisoners. The following extracts from official reports give an idea of the fighting. Rhodes writes, "The total number of men carried into action was about 2,200. The aggregate number present at camp was, however, 2,587. The 6th Ayler lost nearly 60% of its aggregate force. Some of its men were drowned after having been wounded, as they fought at times in a swamp in which the water was from 6 inches to 2 feet in depth. The right company of the 6th Alabama was thrown back at right angles to the line of battle by Colin Gordon to protect his rear, and engaged the enemy at such close quarters that its brave commander, Captain Bell, after having fallen wounded mortally, was able to use his revolver with effect upon the enemy. The company fought with great heroism. Its loss was 21 killed and 23 wounded out of a total of 55, 80%. It remains to say a few words of the movements of the unengaged troops on the Williamsburg and Charles City roads. Longstreet at 3:30 p.m. placed Wilcox in charge of his own, Pryor's and Colston's brigades, and ordered him to follow and support Huger. Soon after this order was modified and Wilcox was ordered to precede Huger. But, having moved to the front, he was soon countermarched and ordered to return to the Williamsburg road, and then to follow that road to the front. He had retraced his steps about a mile when his 4th order again reversed his direction. He was now to follow down the Charles City Road, keeping abreast of the firing, which was heavy. And soon a fifth order came, of which Wilcox writes in his report. Again, orders were received in writing to move across to the Williamsburg Road, following country roads and paths through woods and fields, a guide being furnished to conduct the command. The intervening distance between the two roads was low and flat, and in many places covered with water, at one point waist deep. The march was of necessity very slow. It was about 5 p.m. when the head of the column reached the Williamsburg Road. It was at this time that the 11th Ayler and 19th Miss of Wilcox's brigade were sent into the action, as has already been told. Later, these brigades, with the others of Longstreet and Huger, which were brought up, relieved the troops which had been so heavily engaged. So terminated what should properly be called D.H. Hill's battle, for the whole, as we shall see, embraced 3 minor battles at different times and places, and under different commanders. Hill's battle was fought principally against Keyes's corps, and we have seen that Couch with 4 regiments and a battery retreated northward toward the Chickahominy. Here he soon found friends. Sumner's corps on the north side of the river had been formed about 1 p.m. and moved toward 2 recently constructed roadways and bridges across the Chickahominy. At 2:30 p.m. orders to cross were received, and Sumner, having 2 roads, was able to cross quite rapidly. The river was high and rising, and by nightfall and until next morning the stream was impassable. Now we enter upon the second, which may be called Johnston's battle. It has been told how his original plans were destroyed by Longstreet's taking his division to the Williamsburg Road. It must have been near 11 o'clock when Johnston learned where Longstreet was, and realized that it was too late to get the troops back for that day. He hesitated whether to wait and prepare for the morrow or to go on, and unfortunately decided to let it go on. He took no measures to supply the place on the 9-mile road of the 6 brigades of Longstreet. Whiting's 5 brigades, however, were at hand. 3 of them, Whiting's, Hood's, and Pettigrew's, were at the fork of the 9-mile and New Bridge roads, Hatton's and Hampton's in reserve nearby. Toward noon, Johnston left his headquarters, which were on the 9-mile road about 3 miles from Richmond, and took his position at a house near the fork of the 9-mile and New Bridge roads. His intention now was to send Whiting's division down the 9-mile road to cooperate with D.H. Hill's attack down the Williamsburg Road. By coincidence of bad luck, his right wing having lost several hours in the morning, his left wing lost about 3 hours in the afternoon. The signal for Whiting's advance was to be the sound of Hill's musketry on the Williamsburg Road, 2 miles southeast, through a wooded country. This musketry began about 1 o'clock, and was heard in the Federal lines, 5 miles northeast, also near Richmond, 5 miles west, but was not audible 2 miles to the northwest, at the position occupied by Whiting's division and by General Johnston. Longstreet reports having sent a message upon the capture of Casey's first line, but it was not received, and Johnston's first knowledge of the battle came about 4 o'clock, from an officer whom he had sent at 3 to investigate and report. Soon after 4 p.m., Whiting's 5 brigades were put in motion, with Hood in front. Hood was directed to leave the 9-mile road to his left and to push over toward the York River Railroad and find Hill's troops, while the remaining brigades moved down the railroad. Already there had been upon the railroad all day Pickett's brigade of Longstreet's division, sent there by Longstreet before the beginning of the action, to report any advance of the enemy up that road. It is remarkable that Longstreet contented himself with this, and did not utilize this road as a route of advance for some of his many brigades. Besides his own 6, he could have called on some of Huger's 3, and have led a strong attack down the railroad, turning Casey's right flank. An opportunity for one of the most brilliant strokes in the war was here overlooked and lost. Soon after 5 o'clock, Whiting's 4 rear brigades had straightened out upon the 9-mile road, with Whiting's own brigade in front near Fair Oaks Station, when a battery opened fire upon the column from its left. It was the battery with 4 regiments of Couch's division, which had been cut off from Casey's second line and had retreated northward, unpursued, toward the Sumner bridges. Here it had met Sedgwick's division of Sumner's corps, and Richardson's division was not far away. Johnston was riding with Whiting when the Federal battery opened fire, but supposing the Chickahominy to be impassable, he thought that there could be no great force there, and Whiting was ordered to charge the position with his brigade. Near the Chickahominy the ground was rolling, and the enemy's guns secured fine positions. For fully 800 yards, the Confederate advance was exposed to fire. The reception which it met, however, made it speedily apparent that the errand upon which it had been sent was much beyond the dimensions of a brigade. Johnston was impatient and directed the attack to be renewed at once by all the brigades present. Hood's brigade might have been recalled, and several batteries of artillery, not far off, could have found positions against the two batteries the enemy presently had in action. But a very hurried formation of the three remaining brigades, Hatton's, Hampton's, and Pettigrew's, was made, and the attack was renewed without bringing up artillery, although there was much of it near. It was met by Sedgwick's division and Abercrombie's 4 regiments, and received a bloody repulse, to which the enemy's artillery contributed largely, having a fair sweep and no artillery opposing them. Hatton was killed, Pettigrew wounded and captured, and Hampton wounded. Before sundown, Johnston recognized that his attack was a failure, and he was about to arrange that his troops should sleep on their arms and renew the fight at dawn when he received 2 wounds. The first was a flesh wound in the shoulder from a musket ball, and the second, a few moments later, was a blow in the chest from a heavy fragment of shell, knocking him from his horse. He was placed in an ambulance and started toward his headquarters, but suffered such pain from the motion caused by the fearful roads that a litter had to be substituted. He was incapacitated for service until the middle of November, when he was assigned to the principal command of the army in the West. G. W. Smith succeeded Johnston in the command, and the action of the next day is therefore to be called Smith's Battle. It is sometimes stated in Confederate accounts that this day offered the Confederates their best opportunity to crush the enemy, because it is supposed that the Chickahominy was now entirely impassable. This is a mistake. The railroad bridge had been repaired and covered with plank, and was always available for infantry and for horses, though not for vehicles. By 8 a.m., June 1st, the Federal engineers had built a pontoon bridge at the site of the new bridge, but it was under Confederate fire, and the approaches to it were impassable during the flood. By noon, Sumner's upper bridge was again practicable for infantry, and by dark the lower one. By morning, June 1st, therefore, the Federal army was practically safe from any Confederate attack. It had 6 divisions on the ground and a good line of battle, extending across the railroad nearly parallel to the 9-mile road, with its left flank retired and protected by White Oak Swamp. The only chance of a successful assault by the Confederates would have been with heavy artillery fire upon the obtuse angle where Sedgwick's line bent back to connect with the other divisions. The condition of the ground, as well as the unorganized state of the Confederate artillery service, made such an attack impossible, and no effort at it seems to have been made. Late at night, May 31st, Longstreet reported to Smith and received orders to attack in the morning from the Williamsburg Road northward, Smith proposing to take up the battle, with Whiting and other troops, when it was well developed. It is easy to see that the Federals had nothing to fear from anything the Confederates were likely to do.